My name is Vander Nightbrook, and I'm a courier. But not just any courier. I'm the fastest courier there is. Greetings, adventurers. Welcome to the Lorkhon Saga Nutshell series. My new story, Ascendance, is coming. This new story is the culmination of 5 years of ideas and storytelling. And in anticipation of the series, I've decided to create a collection of Lorkhon Saga nutshell videos that will answer all of your burning questions about the story and how the concept was born. We're going to be covering the concept of the saga and what it was based on. We're going to be talking a little bit about the homebrew lore that goes into the story and how that is woven into Elder Scrolls lore. We're going to be talking about the narrative timeline of the story and also character features that are focused on each of the flagship characters in chronological order. These are going to be coming out in bite-sized pieces. So to start with, we're going to be talking about the concept. What was the genesis of the concept behind the Lorkhon Saga? Along the way, we're going to be touching on everything from key story moments to my creative process as the story evolved organically over 5 years of storytelling. So don your armor and let's dive into the fray. Hey, sir, which way to the gate? Hey, mister. Which way to the main gate? Let's start with the concept. What is the concept? To enjoy the story, it's helpful to understand its genesis. So, on May 27th of 2016, the first video in the Rune Runner series drops, and this marks the official beginning of the story, but there's way more to it. The Lorkhon Saga is actually a series of Skyrim roleplay stories featuring flagship characters like Vander Nightbrook, Robard Graves, Marl Keenlet, Shadeling, Twist, and Idastog. There's also a whole host of supporting characters like Stax and Theral, and we're going to be talking about them in turn. All of these stories intertwine thanks to the magic of mods, making for an epic saga spanning 5 years and over 300 videos. So, the flagship stories in the series are Rune Runner, Ashes, Twist, and Barbarian. However, these characters are beloved, and there were several spin-off series that also were related, such as the prodigious adventures of Marlivor and Mr. Whack, the East Empire Wars, Thug, the story of Stax, Son of Stars, Shadeling for Hire, Shadeling Spell Lab, and there's a series of tutorial videos as well that came out as a response to people asking questions about how I was doing what I was doing. There are many questions to be answered in this nutshell series, and I hope to get to them all. So let's start at the top. What is the Lorkhon Saga, and how did it start? Well, to figure that out, you kind of have to go all the way back to May of 2015. That is when we dropped a podcast on the Character Crusade podcast, Episode 4, Parts 1 and 2, called Project Epicosity. Starting in that episode of the podcast, I talked about this concept of Project Epicosity in a play theory segment. This is when the ideas are starting to come together, and if you listen to that podcast, you will hear me kind of walking through the evolving ideas that would eventually become the Lorkhon Saga. So really, basically, what the concept is, and I discuss this in detail in this 2-part podcast series, is really the idea that rather than creating a single character in Skyrim that pursues all of the different quest lines, what if we were to create individual characters with specializations and narrow down the roleplay focus? And then, what if we were to find a way to allow those characters to come together in effect, weaving their stories in and out from one another, allowing them to take part in each other's stories. And really, this whole podcast episode was about discussing this concept and how to pull it off technically, but then also talking about the role play value of having singular characters focused on different quest lines as opposed to one giant generic character where you have to try to always justify why the warrior would pursue the mage quest line, why the mage would pursue the thieves quest line. Why not have a master thief? Why not have an archmage? Why not have a harbinger, the ultimate warrior, right? And then find a way to pull them together into an epic high fantasy party that can do amazing things together. This is really what the conversation in that podcast was all about. And again, this started as far back as May of 2015 when that podcast episode dropped. Really, what made this possible at the time was a mod called Familiar Faces. Familiar Faces allowed you to take a character and import it into a virtual space, if you will, kind of another dimension, right? And when you imported that character in, it would basically take a player character and transform them into a follower. So basically what I laid out in that episode was a theory where you could use this mod, for example, to create a character that was a wizard and started at level 1 and became the archmage. And then you import that character and you create a new character and they become master of the Thieves Guild. And you create an assassin and you create a warrior. And so you're having all of these wonderful individual and very focused role play experiences where you can really explore the crunchy details of role play about that character. And then in turn, each one is imported into Familiar Faces, becoming an NPC. And then finally, you create your Dragonborn, and your Dragonborn becomes the party leader. The Dragonborn goes out and has their own individual experience. But then the Dragonborn pulls in these other characters that you know so well, and you create the ultimate high fantasy party. And then you start going out after some of the larger quest lines, right? You go and do the Civil War quest line. You pursue the vampires. You go after Mirak. You tackle the dragons, whatever it is. It was a concept that really allowed you to immerse yourself in the individual characters rather than creating one giant nebulous character that just does everything. Is the Dragonborn, is Master of the Thieves Guild, is the Listener, is all of these things. That is a harder roleplay experience to have and have it be rewarding. So the whole point of Project Epicosity was to just socialize this idea that really discussed another way of playing Skyrim. Well, that was also the genesis for this idea of the Lorkhon saga. And this whole concept was made possible by the mod Familiar Faces. Now, if you're interested in Familiar Faces, you'll find a link to it in the description below. However, I will warn you, the mod is only available for Legacy Skyrim. There does not seem to be a ported version for Special Edition, and it doesn't sound like it's coming anytime soon. In fact, it's possible this mod has been abandoned, which is a real shame because it made this concept possible without having to build any of your own mods. So what does Project Epicosity and all the things discussed in this podcast have to do with the Lorkhon saga? Well, it was the beginning of me thinking about this concept of tying characters together, and it was the genesis for a concept which I launched back then that was called 5 Fables. Now, 5 Fables did not get very far, unfortunately, and there were several reasons for that. One was that it was too big. I was guilty of over-planning. I was looking way down the road and thinking about what this party would be like and how I would tell this larger story. And it became too big and too overwhelming. At the time, what I had in mind was a concept that involved 5 primary characters. I had thought through these. I had played some of them individually, and these things were kind of loosely falling together, but nothing was definite. Eventually, as I tried to work through the details, The scale of the story became overwhelming, and I abandoned Five Fables as a project. However, some key things did come out of Five Fables, and two of those key things were the characters of Robard and Stax. Through my experimentation with Five Fables, I really came to love these two characters, and it was clear to me that I wanted these characters to survive Five Fables and become something else. So I kept Robard and Stax in my back pocket and pulled them out later. So fast forward exactly almost 1 year, May of 2016, I created a character concept called Rune Runner, and you can find Rune Runner playlist linked below. This was really the first series that would become part of the Lorkhon saga. At the time, I had no idea what the Lorkhon saga even was. I hadn't even thought about it yet. I was just thinking about a fun character to play, and Vander Nightbrook was a fun character to play. He was basically an ADHD wood elf courier, and I decided that I was going to focus on just living in Skyrim, not worrying so much about the larger quest lines, and just see what that experience was like. Later on, I would discover that Vander was a character that not only I loved, but a lot of viewers loved, and would pull him into what would become the Lorkhon saga. The mechanical elements of the story and the overarching lore that would support it really started with the Ashes series. In that series, I wanted to come up with a larger umbrella narrative that would explain why all of these crazy things were going on in Skyrim. Why is there so much war and conflict? Why are there vampires? Why are the dragons coming back? Why is all of this stuff happening all at once and all in the same place? The Ashes storyline was the genesis of the concept of Lorkhon particles. One of the things that you may have noticed if you're paying close attention is that when I mention Lorkhon, I'm not referring to the god Lorkhon, but Lorkhon, Lorkhon. That's not a misspelling, that's intentional. Lorkhon is a reference to particles created through the pulverization of the heart of Lorkhon by Red Mountain. These particles are spread across the continent, and if you look at the prevailing wind patterns, you'll notice that most of the ash from this volcano flows north from Morrowind and ends up deposited in Skyrim. The concept, which I will be discussing in much more detail in episode 2 of the Nutshell series, is that the accumulation of this ash and its incorporation into the soil, the drinking water, and the food that people eat has both positive and negative effects on those places it affects. And it affects Skyrim predominantly because that is the direction of the prevailing winds from Red Mountain. So once the lore came together, I started thinking about how I could create overlapping stories. This time, I was approaching it in a much more organic way. Rather than trying to create everything all at once, I was just trying to create good character experiences and find ways on my own to take characters I loved and make them into NPCs. This took me down the path of modding. And at that point, I really started practicing and looking for ways that I could take beloved player characters and turn them into NPCs that I could use and that I could voice in other stories. So at this time, I really dug in and did my research, and I figured out how to take the facial data of a player character, save that out as a file, and then use it to create my own NPCs. And I started the practice of actually creating NPCs for every player character that I made. And pretty soon, it became pretty easy. It became second nature to do this. And so I created mods. Marl as an NPC with facial presets. Stax as an NPC with facial presets. Vander, Robard, and pretty soon these characters started showing up in other stories. At first, it wasn't a cohesive narrative. At first, it was really more about the novelty of viewers being able to see a familiar character in a different story. But eventually, it evolved into a much larger story that incorporated multiple characters. So, when I found myself unable to use familiar faces in Skyrim Special Edition, the concept grew organically, and it was that slow, methodical, organic growth that really made it fun and interesting and doable, rather than being focused on this large narrative and worrying about whether or not it was going to come together. I focused on the individual character stories, and I allowed them to evolve over time. I brought other characters in and out, and the story just created itself. Now, you would think, given all the time that I've spent podcasting and YouTubing with Skyrim and talking about these concepts of creating a high-level character concept where you understand the psychological profile of a character and then letting the story evolve as Skyrim presents you with things, you would think that I would understand that formula. But with the Five Fables concept, I was really failing to eat my own dog food, as it were. So later on down the line, when the Lorkhon saga began to evolve, it just happened on its own. Skyrim created the stories for me, and all I needed to do was make sure that I was creating great characters and I knew those characters intimately. So that's the story of how the concept came together and how I supported it with both off-the-shelf mods and custom mods. If you have any questions at all or comments about this nutshell video, please feel free to post them below and I will try to answer your questions as soon as I can. In the meantime, stay tuned for the next Nutshell episode where we will be discussing the lore that drives the Lorkhon saga. For more information, check the description for links to videos, podcasts, and the resources mentioned below. You will also find the definitive Lorkhon timeline explaining all the playlists and characters that are part of the Lorkhon saga canon and the recommended viewing order. See you in the next video. Well, there's plenty of reading material. Too bad I don't have the patience to read. Who are you? Huh.